Says we are live. Okay, now, or maybe it might be this other button. Let's try again. Let's see. Okay, I think now we are really live. Okay, good, nice. So welcome everyone. Yeah, Facebook and Zoom aren't the greatest friends, but I hope we figured it out. So I'm very excited. We have a very nice session lined up for you with our two Michaels. We have Dr. Michael Molitor here, who are going to refer to MM, just to make it easier for the discussion today. And then we have Michael 𝗏𝗏 here from Reimagined Habitat, Net Zero Plus, and Efficient Habitat, so which we're going to call MD, just again to make it a little bit easier to avoid confusion. So what we're going to do is I'm going to get both MM and MD to give us a little bit of an intro about who they are and what they're doing. And then we're going to dive right into our topic, the unpriced climate risk, what it means for Australia and for Australian homes, and how you can actually reduce the risk. And if you have any questions, please put down questions in the chat sections. And then at the end, we're going to go to get back to the questions. Or if you watch the recording at some stage, please just put down your questions at the bottom. And any one of the Michaels or myself can get back to you after. So welcome, Michael, or MM and MD.
Thanks, Simone.
Yeah, thanks, Simone.
Good. So maybe we do start with you, MD. Maybe if you just give a small intro, most people that are on the live might know you. And then we go for a bit more detail into MM, because that's why we're here today.
Well, my background is incredibly boring compared to MM's, so I'll keep it out quick. So I'm obviously the owner of Reimagined, Efficient Habitats, and Net Zero Plus. So we do the passive house design, energy analysis, and a whole lot of prefab and high performance windows as well. So our biggest focus is really on trying to help democratize healthy, resilient homes. And it was through that journey of exploration that I met MM, who I sometimes call M2. So if I note it as M2, it's only because it's two M's, Michael. So I know you would prefer to be M1. I get that, right? But if I do call you M2, that's just understand. So I'll hand over to Michael because he's taught me a hell of a lot in the short time we've known each other.
Yeah. Thanks, Simone, and thanks, Michael. Maybe M squared. I mean, maybe we just go exponential.
I thought that might have some connotations. You are a professor and all the rest of it. So yeah.
Thanks, everyone, and good afternoon, everyone who's following. I started my life as an academic. In my family, we have my parents, university professors. So the family business is get a PhD, do a postdoctoral fellowship, and then try to get a tenure track faculty position. I actually started my life looking at seafloor mining on the ocean floor. So this idea that we were going to mine the ocean floor for these polymetallic nodules, which are now back into vogue, and that whole debate is happening. But in the course of my studies, I ran into 𝗪𝗏 at the University of California, and he grabbed me and said, look, we're not going to mine the ocean floor in your lifetime, but we have a carbon dioxide problem in the atmosphere. And so you should switch your focus from seafloor mining to this atmospheric CO2 carbon dioxide problem. I had no idea what he was talking about, but as I started reading the science and the literature, it was super exciting. So I made that transition, and I started my life trying to figure out how much carbon produced by human emissions is going into the oceans, and what happens to that carbon in the oceans, and what's the ultimate fate of that carbon, and how does that exacerbate the climate problem? I'll get back to that in a minute. I then finished my PhD postdoc. I joined the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of California Climate Change Program. And shortly thereafter, a very obnoxious Kiwi who was running BP's climate program. So this is BP, the giant oil company in London. They had a new CEO, and he was about to make public a very aggressive target to reduce BP's carbon emissions around the world. The problem was they couldn't figure out where their carbon was or how to count it. So I started working with them. And then eventually I took a 2-year leave of absence from my University of California post. And I joined as an external advisor in London, BP's climate change team. And then at the end of that 2-year stint, I was happy to go back to California when PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, approached me. And I made the transition to be the global leader of PwC's climate change practice, basically helping very, very large companies that were carbon intensive. So airlines, oil, gas, mining, glass, steel making, all those sectors are carbon intensive, helping them think about what the risks are and create strategies for effectively managing those risks. So I stayed in London, worked for PwC as the climate change practice leader, and then made a jump to McKinsey as a climate change advisor at McKinsey, and then came back to Australia, joined the University of New South Wales Climate Change Research Centre right at its infancy in 2005. So now I don't have that much involvement anymore with my colleagues at the CCRC at UNSW, but I do try to keep on top of the science through my colleagues there. I'm now advising startup companies, climate tech startup companies, and then I also advise large companies and the New South Wales government on this sort of climate and energy transition. So that's what makes it, and that's what led me to MD, because residential property in Australia is the most valuable asset, right? It's worth about $13 trillion. It's the largest asset class, and it's at risk. It's tremendously at risk. And so the solution, I mean, what MD does and what his companies do, right, is really think about how we make that transition. So that's how we came together, and that's how I find myself on this webinar with MD today.
Nice, beautiful. And then we were just talking about, before we went live, about the National Climate Risk Assessment, a report that just was released earlier this year. So, and we were just talking about, should we go in with the very harsh truth and then backtrack? And we kind of decided, let's just bring it out there. What does it actually mean?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think I'll bring up the page, because I've got it here on the other screen. But yeah, Michael, don't be modest here. Michael was the one who was screaming from the rooftops about this, but only calling it a $400 billion problem when the assessment came out with a bigger number. So, yeah, people are now calling you back saying, yeah, but you might have been right here. What do we do? So, yeah, I'll leave it on to you.
Yeah. If you go ahead and put up that page from the assessment. So
and apologies for making people depressed.
Yeah. So we're in a world now where we haven't done much about climate change. And as a result, we have a lot of assets around the world, right, that are at risk. And so organizations like McKinsey, for example, have made an attempt to assign a number to how large that unpriced risk. So the number now is somewhere around 65 trillion US dollars. Let me be clear what that big global number means. Banks and insurance companies, banks have loaned money to all kinds of assets around the world, to farms, to bridges, to homes, all kinds of assets. And insurance companies have written policies to insure all those properties. That unpriced risk number, right, is the total amount of the asset value that's at risk from climate change. Right? Okay, so the Australian federal government made an attempt to look at that number and try to ascertain, what does that mean for Australia? If you look at, on the notable insights, the last paragraph on the left side of that page, right? And so look, losses in Australian property values are estimated to increase to AUD 611 billion by 2050 and could increase to 770 billion by 2090. So this is the Australian federal government's report. And so that's the amount that's their view today on the total value of residential property, or property that's at risk. I apologize, there's a little bit of noise in the background. So this is both a giant problem and it's also a giant opportunity. But let me segue that into just a little what I call PhD in a minute. I speak to a lot of people on climate change, and I find that most people have a basic understanding, but being able to marry the problem with solution isn't that easy. So I apologize for those of you that know this, but let's assume today you drove your car or you took an Uber, right? And that trip emitted 12 grams of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Your fuel, you're combusting the fuel, and one of the byproducts of that combustion is carbon dioxide. So it comes out the tailpipe. Those 12 grams, about half of those 12 grams, so 6 grams, right, will remain in the atmosphere on a time scale of centuries, right? And the atmosphere is super well mixed, so those carbon dioxide molecules are going to drift and be taken all over the world. About 25%, or 3 grams, gets reabsorbed back into the terrestrial biosphere by plants. Plants take in carbon dioxide to grow, right, and to build plant matter. So that's 3 grams there. And the last 3 grams go into the ocean, right? Which is what I used to do for a living, try to understand that 25% that's going into the oceans, right? You know, what ultimately happens to it, okay? So just give you some numbers, we're emitting about 50 billion metric tons. So that's 1,000 kilograms or 2,200 pounds for those of you on the American system. 50 billion metric tons is what we emit per year, right? And the concentrations of atmospheric CO2 now at about, well, I looked at the website today, and I can give you the actual number for today. It's 426.4 ppm. Now, that number may not mean much to you, but in the absence of humans burning fossil fuels, deforesting, making cement, making glass, all these things that we do that emit greenhouse gases, or mostly these carbon-based gases in the atmosphere, right, increase that atmospheric concentration. In the absence of those, we would normally, in this time period, we'd be around 280 or 290 ppm, right? So that's the sort of natural background level. So 426 is enormous. It's also enormous because not only the absolute change, but the rate of change. So what drives climate instability and all these problems, and we can talk about the 2022 Northern Rivers Lismore floods as a perfect example of that. What drives this problem are not the annual emissions, but the total amount of carbon CO2 in the atmosphere. That's the key driver of change. Okay, so think of it this way. When we load those gases in the atmosphere from human activities, those gases can trap more heat. So think about taking the entire atmosphere and ocean system and giving it a lot more horsepower, right? So the climate system now has more energy. If it has more energy, it can deliver what? More storms and more intense storms. So what we're seeing is the increase in both intensity and frequency of these extreme weather events all over the world. Some of those are floods, right? Some of those are fires, even inundation from rains, hail, human health impacts from air quality, from smoke and bushfires, right? A number of things, right? And so the damages from those are rising exponentially. And insurance companies, and now, just starting now, banks are beginning to think about those challenges, right? So the total amount of that 64 trillion in Australia, including housing, is probably close to $1 trillion, right? So we have $1 trillion of unpriced climate risk, and the biggest part of that is the unpriced risk sitting around the residential sector, right? The most valuable asset that we have in Australia.
Yep.
All right, so time to go and get a little drink or something like that. Recover from all. And Michael, you and I started. Well, we've had many different conversations, but a lot of this really triggered to me, and I became a lot clearer and more real when you were talking about what you did do with the Northern Rivers scheme. And you and I confirmed that you are allowed to talk about that today. So perhaps you could talk about what your role was with that, what it was trying to do, and how you got to where you got to as far as where Lismore should move to.
Yeah. So those of you, you'll remember in 2022, we had these absolutely devastating floods. I mean, like a 500-year flood occurring in and around Lismore. Thousands of homes were destroyed. If you look at that area around Lismore. Lismore is actually part of a giant caldera, which is basically a volcano, a sunken volcano. So the whole area is like almost like a perfect bowl. Probably the single worst place you could imagine putting a city. But of course, I mean, Lismore, I don't know how old Lismore is, right? I'm sure it dates to some part of the 19th century. And of course, they weren't thinking about that. There was a lot of water there. It was a good place for that, right? So those floods, the New South Wales government created the Northern Rivers Reconstruction Corporation, and its focus was one, to help those families that lost their homes, right? And acquire some of those homes and return money back to those people. And then, of course, build new homes, right, to accommodate those people, but also because the state would like to see that area as a growth area. So not just return the population to what it was, but find ways of increasing the population and making that a center for economic growth. So obviously the first challenge, the first problem is, you don't want to build 3,000, 5,000 homes in that floodplain, right? You don't want to expose the next generation of homes to the same levels of risk that destroyed most of Lismore in 2022. So there are numerous companies, including the giant reinsurance company Munich Re and others, boutique firms that are taking climate data from climate models, right, and attempting to predict what might happen at any given location, even down to an individual address, right? So there are platforms where you could drop your home address in, and they will tell you what your 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 15 year, 30 year risk looks like for a number of extreme climate risks, right? So whether that's bushfires, fires, flooding, thermal expansion, hail, all those things in one. There is some challenges to that because there are academics who say the models aren't good enough to give you that kind of feedback for a specific location, right? In other words, we only have one Earth. We're conducting this massive experiment on it. So what we do, and we don't know the outcome, what's going to happen because it's never happened before. So we build in a supercomputer another Earth, and we play with it. We say, okay, what happens if CO2, atmospheric CO2 doubles? What happens to the wheat belt in Western Australia, for example, right? And the models come back. But the resolution of the model, how small it can go to give the answer, the resolution isn't small enough to give you an answer the size of a property. That's not stopping people from doing that. So for the Northern Rivers, the first challenge was they were going to acquire land and build homes on those lands. So, I mean, you can imagine the first step would have been, let's identify lands in and around Lismore that have very, very low physical climate risk, right? And so that's exactly what they did. They acquired land. Now, it's not zero risk. I mean, that area is called the Northern Rivers for a reason. There's a lot of water up there, right? So you don't take the risk to zero, but you can dramatically lower the risk through site selection. So I haven't since that process. I know they acquired land. They're building homes on that land, and so the question is, it's great that you're going to place a home someplace where there's not going to be another flood and hopefully not a bushfire, but what are you doing with respect to the building of the home itself, right? Not just its location, to also lower that risk, right? And that has been a challenge. We have people thinking about where to put homes to avoid climate risks, right? I think we have less people thinking about, once you've built that home, right, what can you do to lower risk? Now, in Queensland, they raise houses up, so the idea that flood water is going to flow under the house, but that is a nascent area, and that's one that MD knows quite a lot about.
Thank you. I know you were trying to transition, but I'm going to bring you back to back to the Northern Rivers, because when you and I were talking about this, you were saying that when you were involved in the team investigating all of this for the Northern River scheme as to identifying, was that the key issue was around insurance, right? And that the insurance companies had the best modeling for climate change that you had seen, which seemed really far out there when you first said it. And then as soon as I thought about it, I thought, well, yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense because they're the ones who are reinsuring everything. And for people who don't know about reinsurance, you go to whichever company that you are getting your home insurance from, and they on-sell that risk to the reinsurance companies. And these are enormous groups globally, many or most based in Europe. And you were saying that Munich Re was the one that you believe was the one who had the best one, the best modeling. And so running off the back of there, because obviously if this is the best modeling, and this is also, no use building something that can't get insured. I don't know whether you've got a couple of comments on that or whether I just covered it off.
Yeah, no. So, the three largest insurers of homes in the United States, these are giant multi-billion-dollar companies, right? In the last 2 years, they've all announced they are no longer insuring homes in Texas, Florida, and California. Now, you need to understand something, right? Those are the three most lucrative residential property insurance markets in the world, right? So when the largest insurers in the United States are saying, we won't insure your home in any of those states anymore, right? All right. That's a glowing, right, signal that something is wrong. In fact, in California, my home state, insurance premiums are soaring, right? So the reinsurers, right? Think of the reinsurers as the companies that insure insurance companies. Michael's right, MD's right. They're transferring that risk, and that's essentially what they're doing. They're transferring the risk to the reinsurers. Those reinsurance companies are at risk, right? They are most directly exposed to most of that $64 trillion, right? So for them, if they don't effectively solve that problem or find a solution for that, their share price doesn't go down by 44%. They become Kodak, right? They're out of business. So the reinsurers are putting pressure on insurance, and we're seeing that now even in Australia, right? And so the next step is the impact on property values as a result of rising insurance costs, right? And then the banks will begin to increase your mortgage interest rate, right? They'll use that to reflect the risk. Now, let me say something that's very, very important, because there's two different types of climate risks here that we're talking about. One is physical risk. Physical risk is you have a house on a beach, right? A flood comes, a hailstorm comes, and your house takes a big loss as a result of an extreme weather physical event, right? Taking a whack out of your house. That's physical risk. Of that $64 trillion that's been identified as unpriced, most of it is not physical risk. Most of it is transition risk. What is transition risk? If you take the eastern suburbs of Sydney for a moment, right? And there have been attempts to map out which pockets are most at risk of physical risk. It varies. Some places where you have a ravine, right, and a downhill slope, that's more at risk than a higher elevation, that's away from the wind. So if you take all of the eastern suburbs, for example, there's a wide discrepancy between the individual risk of each property. The problem is that insurance companies and banks aren't going to look for each house that has a problem, and everyone who doesn't have a problem, so we say, oh, you're in the clear. They're going to raise interest rates and insurance premiums for everyone, right? They're going to spread that risk across everyone. So you may have a property with very, very low risk. You're still going to see your mortgage interest rate increase, and you're still going to see your insurance premiums increase. So transition risks are losses to asset values that are a product of someone usually quite large, attempting to mitigate their physical risk, right? So for most people, for most companies, right, the biggest risk is this transition risk, and that is the market moving towards pricing these risks and spreading that risk out.
Thanks, Michael. I mean, for those people on here or may watch this later who know me, they're probably sick of me using the word risk, because I talk about risk all the time, Michael. And a lot of people that I speak to in the building industry, or just mums and dads who are doing it all, just keep thinking I'm back in my old investment world and talking about risk and research. But this is this is one of the reasons why we as a group went down the pathway of passive house and more resilient homes. Because you just see the risk of this stuff happening, and you look at the global trends, and you know what you were saying here, it's just coming. And so, you know, how a big part of what we're thinking about always is how do you de-risk that? And I mean, for me, a big part of that is resilience, and this is, you know, this is part of the talk that we're having. And I remember, Simone, when you came and joined the company, you were talking about, I think it was a couple of years ago, the AIA, the Institute of Architects, their whole conference was based around resilience. So it had gone past performance, it had gone past circular economy, it had headed towards resilience. How are we going to deal with these risks? And I was thinking about it as you were talking. I mean, we were just our team, my group, we're fairly geographically diverse. And this morning before this, I was on a conference, and we had some team in the Philippines. So they've just been through 3 enormous typhoons, one after the other. And to suggest that they're punch drunk is, you know, the understatement of all days. We've got another guy who's starting with us very shortly, and he's up in Brisbane. He was there, and he's just been affected by the hailstorms that just came through Brisbane last week, and talking about the massive hailstorms. And, you know, I was in Sydney in '99 and got belted by the hailstorms. So I got PTSD about that stuff. You know, I was in Sydney yesterday with you, and it was 36 degrees, and yet earlier last week, Simone, you and Bevan from down in Melbourne, you were in jumpers and almost huddling around a fire because it was down around the 14s. And just this variability and flipping and flopping. That's, you know, if people aren't seeing that, I don't know how they're not dealing with it. But, you know, you were talking about how the homes can be can help around that, Michael. You know, I can talk about this all day, and, you know, I do this stuff all the time. So maybe you could provide some feedback around the sort of things that you think might be interesting about what we can do with homes and why we should be looking at it. And I've also got page 6 of that climate change report up here, talking about the top 10 issues that are going to come from climate change. And I believe that there's 4 of those that housing can actually deal with. But I'll get your view before I switch over to this, if that's all right.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Michael. Well, obviously, the first thing is, right, you want to hope that your house is somewhere where the physical risk is low, right? Because if the physical risk is high, you're going to see the cost of your home insuring it. And if you have a mortgage, right, that's variable, well, they're all variable in Australia. You know, we don't have 30-year fixed mortgages. You're going to see the cost of operating that home increase dramatically. So if you have a choice, right, if you're thinking about moving or you're building a home, right, I mean, the first thing is, right, pick a location where the physical risk is low. That doesn't take your risk to 0, but it dramatically lowers it, and it will be reflected in your insurance premiums and your mortgage interest rate. That isn't fully integrated yet, but we're definitely moving in that. We're definitely moving in that direction. So the house itself, right? I saw a picture from the fires in Los Angeles around Palisades, right? And of course, you know, there were billions of dollars of damage there. There was one house, and the family were concerned about fire risk, right? And so they cleared all of the dry brush around the house, right? Moved the trees, right? And just took a bunch of simple measures, and also had a water storage tank, right? If you look at a satellite image, every house in every direction is burnt to the ground, except their house is standing there with 0 damage. I mean, no charred, no nothing. So there's a lot of simple things, right? First order things, right? Here we go. So Michael just put up this picture of a house design, passive house design principle, right? So, I mean, Michael's the house builder, designer, architect, right? But clearly, you know, passive homes, right, seem to be much more resilient, right? And so I think, you know, using the materials that you use, you know, these you know, color bond aluminum siding, right, that has fire retardant paint on it, right? Those seem to be generating some very, very interesting results, right? The other thing is, collecting water and having water is obviously very important. And then remember, I said one of the climate risks, right? So bushfires, but not just bushfires, just air quality, right? Impacts on air quality and childhood asthma rates, right, are going through the roof. So if you think about an integrated solution, right, and with Australia leading the world with rooftop solar, right, and now we have this vehicle to grid technology that allows you to export power out of the battery of your car, right? Then there's now an overlapping opportunity between making your house climate resilient and making it energy resilient, right? And I think if we're going to move in that direction, and I think this is the most promising opportunity, this is the one thing that I think banks and insurance companies are going to dramatically reward people for. My mortgage, right, is with Bank Australia. They sent me a few years ago, they sent me a letter with 28 items, right? If I undertake any 3 of them within 12 months, they lower the interest rate on my mortgage, or I can finance those changes, right, through the mortgage. And those are, buying an electric car, getting gas out of your house and going to an induction stovetop, right? An EV charger, improving the windows, right? I mean, going to a passive standard, I mean, all of those things, right? And we're moving towards a world where there won't be a green premium for those things. In other words, the value of your house is going to be reflected in your mortgage interest rate and the insurance premiums. So the cost of improving a house from having none of those things to having all those things will be a lot smaller than the uplift in the value. As a matter of fact, I know friends of mine that have spent a fortune, putting world-class kitchens in, right? Because the real estate agent says when you sell, the kitchen's the one thing that's going to return, right? We're moving to a world where these homes that are passive, resilient, right, with solar, EVs, heat pumps, these are going to be the most valuable homes in Australia, and the air quality inside. And so the market's going to move to monetize all of those. And it's going to start with insurance, and it's going to bleed through to banks. And you're going to see these are going to be the most valuable homes. And homes that don't achieve those, right, are going to decline in value very, very rapidly.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just pulling up to the side here so I can bring it over. But when you're talking about those values, so for a long time, Canberra was the only area that we could actually test valuation differentials between non-performing homes and performing homes. But if anybody's, and perhaps I can put it in the chat here afterwards, the 2025 Domain Sustainability Report actually talks about those homes that have a number of those improvements compared to those who don't, are having somewhere between a 9 to 15% difference in their pricing already. So there was a lot of press last year or early this year when that all came out, talking about how the average or the medium home in Sydney, for example, went up by $130,000 if you had done these things. So it used to be, and I did some work on this, and the insurance market in 2013 in the US actually did an analysis of this. It was the reinsurance market again, that when you put $1 into improving the performance of your home, that it was just at that point starting to equate to the valuation was going up by the same amount. And now it's tipped. It's actually physically tipped over into the positive. So I'll drop this in there, but 10 to 15% differential is massive. And we deal with a lot of real estate agents, and there's the ones that get it and there's the ones that don't. So the real estate agents that are just flogging whatever, they, if it's 4-bedroom with a beautiful kitchen in it, that's the thing that they try to sell. But for the people who are in the areas that might care about sustainability a little bit more, what I'm being told is that they're getting 3 to 4 to 5 times as many people turning up to the open homes, and that times from a bidders as well at auctions. So it's happening now. You mentioned the eastern suburbs before. I know a few people there. They are saying that they can't get enough of homes that are upgraded to that amount because everybody wants to buy buy a home like that. If I can jump back, I'm bouncing around between different things up here. I'm sorry. I'm just going to share this screen if it's okay. So this is page 6 or whatever. Oh, this is again the National Climate Change Report, and it talks about the 10 top issues that are going to come out of that. And I think housing can deal with 4 of them. And you've already taken my thunder about one of them, which is where, and thinking about where. The one that I think about a lot is the increase in extreme heat and the health risks. And, you know, again, anybody who's listened to Simone and I bash on about this for a while, health, I think, is the #1 issue for us in the short term. Obviously, we've got climate change, but in the short term, where people are going to have an effect, it's going to be health. And, you know, to give an example of, I'm here in Canberra, and in 2020, we had the massive fires, and for whatever reason, Canberra had the worst air quality in the world for a period of time. And my little office here, it's not passive house, but it's very close to it. It's an incredibly airtight environment. And I've got a little ventilation system which has a filter sitting in there. My house, which is upstairs, is a 1961 unrenovated, thing. So upstairs was like pea soup. Down here, when we had weeks and weeks of 40 degrees, it never got over 27. We had no smoke egress, and we were all down in here. We had 7 of us down in this little space playing Monopoly, playing games, yelling and carrying on over Christmas. It was perfect. It was absolutely fantastic. I also know there's a passive house, and you don't have to go to passive house. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a resilient, healthy home. But there's a passive house level kindergarten in Canberra. And they actually, the owners of the kindergarten moved in there, and they said that the parents of the children who were going to the kindergarten were actually asking to move in there during fires because they couldn't live at home because of the health issues around it all. So I think that, you know, from a resilience and a health, and you talk about the air quality, having a fairly airtight structure that will provide that resilience at a health level is huge. That also comes down to this one, the risk of vector-borne diseases. So, you know, if we're getting diseases and you've got an airtight and mosquitoes can't get in, it's not being transferred through the air. It's a massive, massive change. Water was one you mentioned before about capturing water. Obviously, that, you know, from a design point of view and a capture and storage point of view, it's great. But this is the other one. So the power lines. So I'll just flick back out of here. There's a guy that Simone and I know, 𝗏𝗿, who he did, again, this is passive house. He was in home, he's just outside Bendigo. And during the fires, they lost power for, I think it was 10 or 12 days. And there was not one period of time where he lost power because his house used so little energy from a heating and cooling point of view, and he had the capture and storage set up, that he said it was just fine. He said they just didn't go into town. Yeah, they had enough food. They were absolutely fine. He said we just didn't go outside. It was 40 degrees for 10 days. Didn't matter. So building that resilience in, you know, we talk about doing it in the future. You know, a number of people are sort of doing it now, and I think thinking about that building envelope, thinking about how we might go about that from the early days of designing a new home, I think is really important for new homes. And you and I talk about, well, the 3 of us actually talk about this all the time, but also thinking about how to retrofit the existing stock as well. Yeah, Simone, I know you've.
No, definitely. Just thinking as talking about existing stock. So I'm in the unfortunate situation that I'm looking for rentals at the moment. And I'm one of part of the population that has problems with asthma. So I have massive reactions to mold and dust mites and whatnot. And just going into the rental market, it's shocking, all those old houses where you can literally see or smell the mold. You know, I couldn't do that. And old carpets everywhere, and just so horribly, horribly run down. And yeah, it's just shocking. I think from whatever, out of 10 or hundreds of houses, there may be 1 or 2 that I can even, you know, go and look at, because, you know, they're not half falling apart, or, you know, not full with mold or old carpet everywhere. So it's really shocking, you know. And most people, I think, you know, even if you're not allergic to mold and other things, or even if you don't have asthma, you know, it's not healthy at all to live in homes like this. But unfortunately, a huge part of the population has to live in these homes. And like you said, you know, at some stage, the insurance companies will pick up and everything will change. And then whatever the landlords, you know, will have to live or, see what happens with those properties. But yeah, it's just shocking what's out there in our existing housing stock.
I mean, Simone, that's a great point. I think it goes even further than that. If you think about building these homes that are resilient, right, will endure over long periods of time, are lower to cost of operating, and then the homes that can export power, for example, right, and generate income, you could in fact change the housing affordability equation, right? In other words, if you're the government and you've got to build whatever 1.4, whatever that target 1.2, 1.4 million homes, you've got two pathways, right? Build the crap, just build them as crappy as possible, right? With the least amount of money, right? Or, right, start adopting the kinds of things that we're talking about here. And I think the increase in the value of the home in terms of lowering your operating costs, lowering your cost of capital, lowering your insurance premiums, and then, generating revenue out of the house, that's capable of changing the housing affordability equation, right? These types of homes, in my view, right, there is no more premium, right? I mean, people say, okay, I need I want a 160 square meter, 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom house, right? And I've got two options, right? I can get a builder to build it to the minimum bottom spec that's approved today, or I can spend more and lift it up to start doing some of the things that Michael and I are talking about here, right? What I'm saying is the difference in that cost, whatever that premium is, the premium doesn't exist because right away, right, the property is going to increase more in value, right? And then your operating costs will cover that as well. So, I'm keen to see that premium go to zero, right? So that we stop building these homes in places like Western Sydney, right, where developers are building these big, whatever they are, 200 square meters, 300 square meter, 2-story, right, that are death traps, right, when it's hot, right, and especially the heat upstairs. So I think this is being driven by these unpriced risks, right? We have very large players like reinsurers and very large banks who are saying, we can't take this on. So they're willing to monetize, right, these advantages. In my view, right, this is going to completely fundamentally change the economics of home building and home ownership and the operation of homes, right? And it's in my view, it's the only thing that's big enough to address our housing affordability and housing supply, right, at scale. We have to move. We have to move towards this quickly, because if not,
can I throw a counter to this at the moment though, Michael? Because I talk. We do the energy analysis for a couple of very large builders in the Western Sydney area, and one of them actually came to us and said, "Michael, we build crap. We know we build crap. We don't want to build crap, but that's what we have to do." And I've had years of conversations with these guys and a number of others. And what they're telling me is that the demand side from the better is on the smallest, because all these blocks are getting smaller and smaller, and people are wanting to build bigger and bigger. So it's the behavioral change around trying to say, I want the biggest thing on the smallest block of land that I think is going to be one of the hardest areas. And I spoke to, I can't say who, so the developer of one of the largest land subdivisions in Australia. And I was talking to them about it. And I said, well, why don't we start looking at creating incentives for building smaller, for building, all these things that we're talking about now. So build smaller. We don't need, Australia has the highest per square meter for livability than anywhere in the world. We sit at 89 square meters per person. The US is at 77. I mean, that's nuts that we're that much difference. If you go to Europe, it's 40. I'm not saying we have to go down to 40, but, there's a very, very big difference between 40 and 89. So how do we do that where we're building smaller? And could we do it more efficient? Now, these developers, their comment to me was, and this comes back to the banks, and this is where the banks' behavior has to change for real, not for them talking about it. And they're saying, well, if they go and build a 3-bedroom home that's really efficient, really good quality, all that sort of stuff, their valuation is so much different to if they go and build a 4 or 5-bedroom home, that the banks won't lend against it at the high performing rate. So we've got this thing where the banks are starting to work out they've got this unpriced risk. The insurance companies are starting to work out this unpriced risk. The behavior over here for the individuals is that we're starting to maybe thinking about it, and hopefully people will listen to this and think about it a little bit more, but we're starting to think about it. But the actual behavior by the banks at the moment is prejudicing against building better and smaller. How quickly is this actually going to change? What's it going to need before it actually changes?
You're still muted?
Yeah.
MM?
Oh, MM, you there? No, you're on mute, buddy.
You're mute.
You're on mute. Michael, you're on mute.
I'm trying. My mute button decided to vanish and go. Michael, you're spot on, right? I believe this, right? I mean, I have people coming to me all the time, friends of mine, because I'm waxing lyrical about the advantages of EVs, and they're saying, Michael, if I need a car for my family of 4, right, and I need a certain size, and I've got 2 options, right? I can buy a new petrol car, or I can buy electric for the same amenities, right? The same size, everything else. I'm paying a premium for the electric vehicle, right? And I said, yes, you are, but your fuel. I mean, when you buy a car, you're committing to spending a lot of money for a long period of time, right? Fuel maintenance, right? Your petrol car has 2,000 moving parts. Your EV has 200 moving parts, right? Your maintenance costs are trivial relative to the petrol car. Petrol prices are high, and they will continue going higher. Electricity costs, right, are fuel costs. This is a similar problem, right? In other words, it's like, you walk into a white goods shop and they have all these washing machines, and you can buy a washing machine with a weird name on it that comes from, China, that's super cheap. It's going to use a lot of water, right? It's going to use a lot of energy, and it's not going to last very long. Or you can buy a 𝗵𝗲𝗄, not the $8,000 𝗵𝗲𝗄, but one, right? I mean, my mother-in-law has one that she's had for 19 years, a 𝗵𝗲𝗄 washing machine, for example, right? This is our problem, right? People tell me, Michael, EVs are more expensive. They're not more expensive, right? So all we're doing is comparing purchase price, right? Or the cost of building a home, right? So someone says, I can build a 4-bedroom house at 200 square meters for X, right? It meets the minimum standards. Or I can meet, right, the 𝗪𝗺 standard, and there's a premium, and the banks are worried that no one's going to pay that premium, right? And so the reason why they don't want to lend is they don't see demand for that, because the demand. I mean, are you going to Blockbuster to rent, to rent DVDs, Blu-ray DVDs? No, you're not, right? And so, right. Technology moves on. You're right. We have a challenge, right? It's the same problem with EVs, with washing machines, right? You need a washing machine, buy the cheapest one that you can find, right? And not worry about those future costs, right? Which are, by the way, much larger than the purchase price of the original product, right? So you're right. We have a challenge, right? And so we need to start creating examples. What does, I don't think we have a single home in Australia that's ready for the 21st century, right? So Michael, you and I have talked about this, right? Let's build a home that we think includes all these features. Let's understand what that premium is. And then let's negotiate with banks and insurance companies, right, to lower those costs, right? And let's actually show the world that these homes are actually cheaper, right? It's the overall, right? It's a total cost of ownership, total cost of operation, right? Not the purchase price, right? And yeah, and we always have this problem, right? It's why EV uptake in Australia is small relative to the value that EVs, especially if you've got solar on your roof and you can now sell electricity out of the battery.
Yeah, because of where we are, we're going to get rezoned. So I haven't done a whole lot of upgrades to our house. But I actually worked out the other day that if we convert to the EV and do our solar and everything upstairs, we've got a 1-year payback. A 1-year payback. And I haven't been doing it because I know that we're going to, knock it down or renovate or do something else. But it's like, 1-year payback doesn't matter anymore. Now, those numbers now make a whole lot of sense. And, one of the things that, Simone, I know you and I have talked about is, if we take the numbers out of it, it becomes a why, why not, as opposed to a why. And that's part of the challenge. But I'd be interested. I don't know how many people you can see, Simone, how many people are listening in, but even for, we'll probably post this up on LinkedIn and a few others, and I'd be massively interested to see, and, maybe it's an echo chamber of the people watching and listening. But, people who would be prepared to do something a bit smaller, to actually do what we're talking about getting a resilient home, right? There's always that balance of, it's a lovely thing to talk about. Who's actually going to go and do it? And it's like, we talked about these sustainable homes that you and I have been talking about, Michael, which Simone has actually designed for the company that you and I are working on. And it's a 120 and 160 square meter home for 4 to 5 people. You don't need any more. We don't need any more than that. It becomes incredibly, once it's designed properly, and you get rid of a whole lot of areas. And as we can generate a lot of energy by getting the design right, by getting the pitch of the roof right and storing. And then with, Amber and other groups out there that you can now export instead of having to, the feed-in tariffs that were fantastic years ago, but are now terrible. But there are now companies that are actually paying a reasonable number for taking solar out. And now with the batteries, you can take it out at the right size. These numbers, all of a sudden, they change enormously. And I'm going to be very intrigued to see how quickly this evolves, Michael. And I know there's some studies. You were talking about one in, I think it was in the Netherlands, where they're doing that at the moment with Renault. Was that correct?
Yes, there's a trial in the Netherlands with Renault and a solar provider, right? And then an EV charger, right? And so they're actually testing with the Renault 4 and the Renault 5 all electric vehicles, both now in the Netherlands and in France, right? They're actually trying to figure out, right, what is the cost of putting that system in? How quickly does it generate income, right? And then what's the payback? I think we're going to be pleasantly surprised with the results.
Yeah, and we probably have even better results in a country like Australia, where the sun's out a little bit more than it is in the Netherlands. Or you're French born, so you know a little bit better than us.
Well, I mean, certainly, if it works in the Netherlands, it's going to be a runaway success here, right?
Yeah. We're always banging on around how to, the building science behind what we're doing. For what you're seeing, Michael, sorry, I keep coming back to you because I talk on these things all the time, so I want to hear your views. Would you have a top couple of three at a housing point of view? Right? If you're sitting down as a climate scientist trying to advise, sorry, I'm throwing you on the spot here, trying to advise one of your friends around how to make your home more resilient, do you have a top 2 or 3 that you would have for people in an existing home?
Yeah, I mean, it is, yes. I mean, to the extent to which, well, I tell people, there are services that will fly a drone in the middle of the night on the coldest night of winter, right, and show you all the places where heat is leaving your home, right? So the first thing is, and those are cheap because the cost of putting the proper insulation, especially around doors and windows, and getting that right, and reducing draft, the payback on that is almost immediate, right? And then in terms of durability, I mean, as you know, Michael, retrofitting an existing home to passive is very difficult, right? And the cost sometimes is prohibitive because you've got to pull everything out, pull the walls down, you've got to insulate all of that. But short of that, right? I mean, there are opportunities. I mean, double and triple glazing doors and windows, right? And then swapping out your gas your gas stovetop, right, for induction stovetop, right? A heat pump. I mean, yeah, if you can install solar, that's an absolute no-brainer. In fact, that's such a fascinating and viable financial option that now companies like the National Renewable Network, right, they'll finance all of that, right? I mean, they'll turn your house into a power plant at their cost, right? And then sell you super cheap electricity and then export power off your property. So a lot of these things that have a short payback with really interesting financial returns, you're not going to have to put up capital, as if you don't want to. Somebody's going to do it for you. So Bank Australia has a list of things. All these things they see them all as value improvements, right? So, having an EV, having a heat pump, having induction stovetop, the air quality from burning gas inside your house, it's just insanely stupid, right? I mean, you should not, a gas stovetop, I grew up with it, right? That's what I cook on. But, the air quality challenges, even for childhood asthma, for example, right? They're through the roof. So yes, there's a lot of things you can do, right? And each one of these options has a dollar in, right? Financial, uplift in value out, right? So you can actually decide, right? I mean, unfortunately, we're still in a world where estate agents will tell you, the biggest bang for your buck is improving your kitchen.
Yeah, but again, I think we're changing, and the reason why I flicked over to you to ask that, Michael, and I know it was without any warning, is because that's exactly the sort of stuff that we talk about all the time. So coming from somebody outside of the industry, so to speak, somebody coming from a climate change point of view, it's great that it's exactly the same stuff that we've been talking about for a long time around trying to make homes better, trying to make them more resilient, trying to make them more passive. And again, not necessarily the passive house level, but just to make the things work by themselves so that they are resilient. And we're all singing from the same hymn book. There's no magic pudding here. Physics is physics. If the house is leaky, there's heat coming or going one way or the other. If the windows, if you haven't got insulation and you haven't got shade, either the heat's coming or going one way or the other. It's just physics. It ain't, it's not rocket science. We try to demystify this. It's not rocket science at all.
The other part of this, is let's think about the home building value chain, right? So we have architects, we've got designers, we've got builders, we've got all the companies supplying all the construction materials, right? There's banks financing, there's insurance companies insuring properties, right? There are platforms where you can domain, and realestate.com. So there's an entire value chain. So the most important asset in the country, residential property, it's worth more than everything else combined, right? That's good and bad, right? If there are significant changes to that, right? Our entire economy in Australia depends on high valuations of homes, right? If there was something that wildly decreased that, right? We'd be in serious trouble. I mean, every sector of the economy, from superannuation to you name it, right? Wheat exports, everything would be impacted. But the other way to think about this is that entire value chain, right, is wildly and insanely inefficient, right? And it doesn't build homes for the 21st century. So even, and you know more about this than I do, even the way that we build homes, right? We're still in the 20th century, right? So, you and I have talked about this, but factories using robots, right, to either panelize homes, right? Build all the panels in a factory, flat pack them on a truck, take them to a site and assemble them, or even factories that are now building entire homes, putting them on the back of the truck and delivering them, right? Reducing that time. I talk to councils, right? I talk to people who are fighting long, DA wars, right? I mean, the approval process is terrible, right? I mean, I spoke to one of the wealthiest councils in Australia, and I told them about climate risk, and their jaws dropped. And they said, Michael, what's going to have to happen? I said, well, you're going to see solar panels on most of the roofs. And they said, no, Michael, those are ugly. We don't want those. Right? It's that kind of mentality, right? I mean, I'm sorry, but a solar panel on a roof is the most beautiful thing you're ever going to see, ever, right? Not Spanish terracotta tiles, right? Or all these other fancy things. A roof covered, whether they're solar tiles or solar panels, right? That's the most beautiful, gorgeous thing you could possibly imagine. We're not there yet, right? I've got people all the time who tell me, oh no, Michael, I don't want those ugly panels on my roof.
I found it interesting because I've always been fascinated with wind farms, right? And I know they're quite polarizing or whatever, but to look at one of those big props up in the air, spinning around, knowing that it's clean energy, has been something that's fascinated me forever. And I noticed about 8 or 9 years ago, Samsung started having a windmill as their default background for their phones. I don't know whether you remember this, but it was the default background for the phones for 6 or 7 years. And they'd only, I'm not very bright, so it took me a little while to tweak to it. It was like they were mainly aiming at the kids, because for the kids who know about climate change, they understand it, they intrinsically get it, they learn about it. It's, you know, it wasn't taught at school for you and me, what was for you at university. For them, that's a beautiful thing. So I think there's that generational change as well. And I think for some of the wealthier councils, the councillors are probably a little more our age than, you know, than younger, and therefore that generational change, and, you know, until it starts happening. But sorry, I'll get off that for a sec. One of the things that, again, you and I have talked about is obviously the prefab and the panelizing and everything. And there's some people that we deal with out of Europe, and there's a guy, Eric, who has a place where there's like a display village for prefab, and obviously that's a pathway for, you know, building a lot of homes quickly. And so councils and governments from all around Europe go to this place to see what it looks like, see how they're built, and talk to the businesses. And what he's told me a few times over the last couple of years is that if we're not talking about circularity, if we're not talking about life cycle assessments, if we're not talking about, you know, net zero as a starting point, not even a you know, an aspiration, but that's only part of it. It's actually the life cycle of it all. Then those companies aren't even in the game of getting into being able to, you know, deal with government or institutions. And I just wonder when that's going to start kicking in here.
Well, that's a great question. Look, that $64 trillion of unpriced risk, I mean, governments, regulators, financial regulators are very nervous, right? I mean, the challenge for Australia, like many countries, is if we were to adequately price that risk across the Australian economy, about 37% of the ASX 300 is gone, okay? So regulators have been dragging their feet, right? Even though it's a systemic level of risk, right? Because if they push this now, you may know, or some of the viewers may know, we adopted federal legislation, federal parliament, right? We have legislation, we have mandatory climate risk disclosure for companies now. Companies now have there's a standard format that they have to report on, and the market's gonna find out where that, let's say, $800 billion to $1 trillion of risk sits in the Australian economy, right? Most banks, superannuation funds, large fund managers, they know where that risk is. They haven't started taking the action. Once the market can identify and price that risk, watch how fast this moves. So a key element of this is a legal obligation on the part of companies to adequately report regularly on those risks. So the first reporting year, right, is next year, right? So we'll see.
So what it sounds like you're telling me is, even though that incredibly dire and dastardly start to this conversation, that you're actually sounding quite optimistic at the end of it all, that we're actually going to finally start seeing some action to deal on it, and that maybe this sort of regulation is going to drive it. It's not, you know, industry has often been having to drive these sort of changes because the markets have not done it, but it sounds like we're at a point where the markets now are going to have to.
Well, I think you're right. I'm not going to bet on, I mean, you know, the UN climate negotiations were launched in 1992. The first negotiating session was in 93. And we've had a series of international agreements under that process. Emissions have gone up every year for 34 years. Okay. So the interest on the part of governments to actually tackle this problem has been like virtually near zero, right? So we're not anywhere in the world, we're nowhere on track. In my view, governments have shown and politicians have shown very little interest in tackling this problem on time scale or magnitude relative to the solution. For me, it's going to happen through capital markets, right? I mean, eventually the reinsurers and insurers are going to say, why are we paying out all these claims, right? When companies that are generating these emissions, oil, gas, coal, cement, right, are earning billions of dollars, right, and making millions of dollars of profit, and we're paying that. That's the key tipping point, in my view, right? They're finally going to say, right now, government's view is that energy is so important, right? It's the lifeblood of every economy, that we will continue to subsidize fossil fuels like we do in this country. We'll keep exporting gas, right? Because that's more important than climate change, right? And so we're going to look after those companies because we think they're strategically important for our security, right? When that, in my view, we're probably 12 to 18 months from that flipping, right? Where politicians finally say no, right? They're posting billions of dollars of profits. They're not affected by the costs, right? And everybody else. I mean, the people of Palisades and Loma Linda, where the fires were, right? $300 billion in losses. Those were borne by individuals, right? They're borne by insurance companies, by banks, by the county government, right? 300 billion. That's not a fictitious number. Those are real losses, right? Right? Not one penny borne by companies, right, that are emitting the vast majority of the carbon that's driving this problem. I think that's the key tipping point, and I think I hope that we're within 12 to 18 months away, because when that happens, then everything that we're talking about here, everyone will race to monetize the advantage of homes that are built in factories, that are passive, right, that generate their own energy, right, all of that. Those homes will be, those would be the only homes you see, right? There won't be any new home built anywhere in Australia that doesn't look like that.
Beautiful. All right, I just saw the time, so we might have to wrap it up here. But yeah, Michael, thank you very much for joining us. As always, this could get, well, I know you and I could talk about this for about the next 2 days straight. And maybe we might have to come back on some other topics in the future if you might be up for that.
Love to. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. And sorry I stayed so quiet, but your discussions were so fascinating. I wouldn't budge in too much. But yeah, at least, there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and I can't wait for this change to come. And hopefully then some of the critics or non-believer will, hopefully change their mind. And yeah, until then, let's keep doing.
Were there any questions in the?
Sorry, so one question. Let's just go to that. I think we talked about a few of the things from Sonia mainly. To all of you, great conversation. To all of you, what are the possible considerations as in terms of the transitional risk and planning to build a home? What is one of the questions people can or should consider to ask to future-proof their project?
Mike.
Well,
the energy rating, right? Yeah.
Well, an energy rating that is actually a real one, not and verified and tested at the back end of the build, not done. I think seeing some of the numbers we've been working on recently, being able to make your house resilient, building it properly, building it a bit smaller if you can, and designing it right, but then having it, if you can make a thermally comfortable structure that you can then put on the solar and the EV and have that infrastructure, that electrification infrastructure there as well. There will be models, Michael, you and I know we've been talking to people around these sort of things. There will be models where that will make money in the future. At the moment, it costs money and there's a payback, but in the future, there will be pathways to be able to make money on that. So, if I could say, build an efficient home so that when you capture and store in the future, that you can take advantage of what you are capturing and storing, not just for your home, but how you can actually help the rest of the neighborhood, so to speak.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's really the big transition, right? Where houses go from being passive value creators, right? Your house increases in value because you own a house in Marrickville, Sydney gets more people arrive, more people with money arrive, Marrickville doesn't get bigger, and just through macroeconomic trends, the value of your property. This is how property makes, quote unquote, makes money, right? Okay. But when we move to a world that has the kind of features that we're talking about, right? And you're exporting power, maybe you're exporting data, there's a number of things you could be thinking about. Then you move from a passive value creating asset, which is the biggest one in Australia, to an active one. And I think that's coming fast. I think that's coming very, very fast, right? And that changes the economics of that entire sector and the largest asset in Australia.
Wonderful. That's great. So thanks so much to both of you, Michaels. And yeah, again, if someone is watching this as a recording and you have any questions, please direct them to us and we will get back to you. Yeah, thank you very much. And I hope we have you in one day again soon for another session.
Yeah, thank you, Simone. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks.
Bye.